Okay, so Colette, thank you so much for joining me again here. We spoke a few weeks ago last, and I'm super stoked to circle back with you now and to tell you about how the race went. So why don't I introduce you here first, and then we can kind of jump right in. So Colette is a registered dietitian, and you are the athlete care manager at Skratch Labs. And you've been working with athletes for a few years now, I think 4 or 5 years in various capacities. So today, everyone, we are going to be, I'm going to be basically kind of asking you questions. I want to have a conversation again, similar to what we did a few weeks ago, but we're going to be opening it up throughout the hour here for questions from you guys at home. So feel free to post your questions into the chat and we'll kind of get to them throughout the hour. But before we jump in, Colette, I was hoping you could kind of tell me more about your role at Skratch Labs and kind of in what capacity you work with athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a registered dietitian. So I work with athletes as my specialty, trained in all different types of nutrition, but specifically at Skratch, I work primarily with athletes. And my role is to help athletes learn more about our products, about proper sports nutrition, about hydration, and also take the feedback and the learnings that I take from our athletes and to help that improve innovation and learn better research and development, and then bring back more information for our athletes through our blogs and recipes and all of those things. So I have a really special role in which I get to interact with athletes all the time, but I also get to do a lot of the behind the scenes stuff at Skratch Labs to make our products better for athletes.
Yeah, so you're kind of the conduit between, it's like a feedback loop. You get feedback from athletes, and yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, so it's a little different than previous roles as a sports dietitian. I still get to interact with my athletes, which is the part that I love the most. And meeting people like you, Jeff, make my day better all the time.
Well, with that, and that's how we met. Was I was offered a consultation with you, so you jumped on a call with me and we talked about, my upcoming race. We talked about kind of my diet in general and also my strategy, my nutrition plan for that race. But what I really liked, what I enjoyed about our conversation is you weren't just trying to pitch me on Skratch. You even said, like, I'm here to, give you good advice, whether that involves our product or not. Or our products. And that's what I really liked. That's obviously you, as a registered dietitian first and foremost, and a Skratch Labs employee secondary. So today we'll be talking, I do want to talk about the product a little bit, but we are going to talk very generally as well. And so that's great. So if you guys have questions about Skratch Labs in particular, ask those. But again, general questions are good to go as well. So why don't I tell you a little bit about how my race went? Because we haven't had a chance to catch up.
More.
So yeah, and for everybody at home as well. So my nutrition strategy, this was a 7-day staged race where we had to carry everything that we're eating for the week. So it's lighter is better, smaller is better. It's all about size, volume, and of course, weight. So powders work really well, and that includes things like sports drinks, and then of course dehydrated meals when it came to food. But being out there for 7 days, I had to think about not just carbs and sugar, but other macronutrients. And we talked a lot about fat and protein and the role that plays as well. But while I was running at a fairly fast pace, a fairly big effort. So I did need quick burning fuel as well. So I decided to go with Skratch Labs Super Fuel as my primary fuel source, and it worked great. So I did about 200 calories of Super Fuel per hour, which is a powdered sports drink. It's primarily carbohydrates, but also some electrolytes. And I did that every day except for the long stage, which was 6-7 hours. So I supplemented that with a few bars. And for that, I actually use Skratch Labs bars as well, because I realized in talking to you that those bars are actually the energy bars, I think they're just called. Is that right? Yeah. Those are actually not butter based, which has some fat and protein and is sort of slower burning. So, and also really good calorie to weight ratio for nut butters. So that worked really well as well. So powders on every day except for the long stage, a couple of bars to supplement, and it worked great. I wasn't hungry and I felt like I had enough energy. And then of course, as soon as I was done, I would do a protein shake, and I used Skratch Labs actually protein shake as well, and then went to my dehydrated meals. So I think everything worked exactly as I'd hoped. I finished second place overall. I was on the podium, which was my goal. But I was there to run my own race, and I think I was able to execute well based on the nutrition strategy that you helped me with. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. You did crush it out there. And I think we were really able to figure out something that worked best for you. And these longer stage races are definitely a lot more challenging. And as a practitioner, for me, those puzzle pieces are a lot more exciting, but in the same time, there's a lot that can go wrong. So
Yeah.
you were very lucky, and I'm very glad that we were able to find something that worked perfectly, because I have dealt with, all different kinds of situations. And sometimes we think it's going to work and everything changes. But I think that as a dietitian is why it's so important to learn the whys, and not just what to do, because
Yeah.
you make the decisions for yourself. So being out there and being able to change plans on course is so important if you had to.
Yeah, and that it was a risk of going with drink mixes with powders. Is that had I been walking instead of running, and I was out there for double as long, I wouldn't have double the calories. I might have gotten really hungry, and so I would have wished I had more solid foods. So that definitely was a risk, but fortunately that worked out okay for me. But I did also test this stuff during my training, and that was so important, right? Like you don't want to be doing anything new on race day, especially not when you're committing to 7 days in a row like that. So that was really important that I did test those products out. Something you had mentioned, and I do think about this, but we forget about this sometimes. When we're testing during training, we're not, of course, simulating the same sort of day after day. And you brought up the idea that we need to be careful about flavor fatigue as well, and things like that, where something can taste good on day 1 or 2, but by day 3 or 4, it's hard to stomach it or even just to get it down, right? So that's maybe another consideration.
Yeah, flavor fatigue is really big for athletes who are doing longer efforts, even if it's a single day race. Especially during multiple stages, you just get sick of eating or drinking the same kinds of things. So I find that the less sweet products usually work well for the later days, because that's usually the first thing you get sick of is sweet. Usually salty doesn't go away because you're sweating and you're using you need those electrolytes to replenish. So your body usually craves those things, but sweet just gets really old really fast. So if you can bring different flavors of things so you can have some variety. If not, mix things up by adding bars or chews or any kind of other snack in there if you can, if you're really getting sick of something. And lastly, I always say to bring some kind of treat that you really love. I know that it's not always the most ideal thing to pack, but if you have a favorite candy or snack that you love, sometimes that gets you back into eating and you're more comfortable and you can get something down and then get the energy and the mindset to get back to eating, because that can be really, really difficult as well. Some of flavor fatigue and all of that is a mental game. You are going for so long that you just have to get it down, but also giving yourself some excitement with your food can help it make it a lot easier.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And even just having something to look forward to, where you can think, a couple more hours and I get to have that, like you said, that treat or that thing that you maybe look forward to in the middle of the day. I didn't have one on this one because well, I shouldn't say that, because actually those Skratch bars were probably, I think, on the long stage where I was like, I get to actually eat something on the run. But no, I didn't have one on this one because I was so focused on weight minimization. But I almost always do on longer races, on longer training days. I almost always do.
And if so, what would it be?
Well, it depends what I'm doing. So if I'm eating a lot of bars and stuff, like I might, for example, I'm doing the Tour de Mont Blanc coming up later next week, and I'll probably be doing a lot of more traditional run food. But at some point, I'm going to have a Snickers bar like every day. I love Snickers bars, and because it doesn't feel, it's still sugary, right? But it doesn't feel like run food, and you can buy them anywhere, so it's always a great thing when you're traveling. So I'd say Snickers bar tends to be something, especially in a 100-mile race. I'll always do at least one Snickers bar at some point, and I always kind of look forward to that. So.
Yeah, you brought up a really interesting point in something you can get everywhere. I do think it's really important as athletes to try something that are easily available at a grocery store, at a gas station, wherever you're traveling, because something could always go wrong when it comes to traveling for these big events. I've had athletes lose whole bags. I've had athletes get stuff taken away from them at the airport. It happens. And so what happens then if you are left with, your plan being kind of torn apart. I always say, like, practice with a couple things that you maybe not are not ideal, but you can find, whether it be bars, snacks, any of those things, even drinks that you can easily find, because if something goes wrong, you want to make sure that you have plan A, plan B, and plan C. And having a couple of those things also just to look forward to, that you can just buy there if you realize that you needed it or forgot it.
Or if your bag gets lost, as seems to be happening a lot right now, right?
It's
With
happening
travel.
a lot, especially for
Yeah.
races in Europe right now. It's
Mhm.
left and right, or companies are saying, we're not even allowing you to check a bag in at this point. I think even in Amsterdam, I saw some emails about that. I'm like, that can really derail your nutrition plan for a lot of athletes. So having a couple things you practice with, even if you're not going to use them, is always good practice.
Yeah. And one thing, I mean, one tip, I've mentioned this a couple times in my packing videos and things, you always want to keep stuff in its original packaging. Never put powders in nondescript bags. Wait till you get to your destination to do that. That's a recipe for disaster otherwise. So especially when it comes to like drink mix powders that are just white powders. Like,
yeah. It's definitely a good idea. Always try to check them if you can, instead of doing carry-on with powders, because they might pull them out and want to test them. Try to do unopened packaging if you can, if possible. Not always the most possible, but if you can do that, because it just makes it easier for traveling. Traveling is probably the hardest part of the planning process.
Yeah, and for a lot of us, that's all of our races involve travel, all of our big key events. So it can be a real stressful part of it. And I think that's another reason too. I mean, we're getting a little bit on a tangential topic here, but when you travel, kind of going somewhere early. So if you had to, you could go and buy stuff again. You have a few days or a week buffer. Now, having said that, Skratch Labs so you're based in Colorado. Chad actually asked that question. Chad, good to see you. You're from Colorado as well, and I was just down there last week. And so obviously, like, there's a lot of athletes there, skiers, mountain bikers, road cyclists, all sorts of athletes. You distribute currently in North America but not in Europe. Is that right?
We distribute in Canada, we distribute in the UK, not in Europe, but in the UK. And South Africa, and a couple other international distributors. We're working on a couple more. Unfortunately, Europe is the hardest market to get into. So you always, for European trips, try to take and pack. It is very expensive to ship anything out. And if you are going out and you're having issues, lose your bag, whatever, send us an email at Skratch. If it can't be Skratch, let me help you recommend something that's similar. Because we know that's a really hard part about our company, is that we do sell in a lot of places, but Europe is just not one of them. The UK is the closest that you can get in Europe to getting Skratch.
I want to go back now to talking about Superfuel, because one thing I didn't touch on was one of the reasons I chose that. I evaluated, so I landed on the strategy of using drink mixes pretty early on in my training this year. And I then was evaluating a few different products. And what stood out to me about Skratch was, first of all, what I had heard. So I had heard the brand. I've heard of it for years. You guys have been around for a while, but I'd never actually tried it. And then in October, when I ran in Namibia, the Namib Desert Race, which was another Racing the Planet race, like what I did in Georgia, Rob, who won the race, was using Skratch. And so was Ben, actually, who came second place. I asked them about that. First of all, I was curious about their choice of using powders, and also about that specific brand. And Rob had been the medical director for Racing the Planet races for years. And he said he's seen that tends to be the one thing people can get down when they can't get anything else down. And he's done triathlons. And he said, that's the one thing I can drink all day. I've been out there for 7-8 hours. And when I started looking into it, it sounded like there was actually a different molecular structure to the product, because you guys use cluster dextrin as opposed to maltodextrin, which is literally like a cluster, is that right, of molecules that therefore takes longer to break down in your system. So it's a slower release of sugars. You don't get that crash, that spike rather, and crash. Can you talk more about that? Did I summarize that properly?
Yeah. So Superfuel is a product that uses highly branched cyclic dextrin or cluster dextrin. basically it is a wreath of, 60 to 70 glucose molecules basically wrapped all together into a cluster. What makes it different than maltodextrin is that maltodextrin is usually somewhere between, 5 and 20 glucose structures, but the release of both of these higher dense glucose structures are very different. Maltodextrin releases like a firework almost. They all kind of release at the same time, whereas cluster dextrin doesn't start breaking down until it gets into your gut, and it breaks down kind of more slowly, like branch by branch. And so you're getting a lot more of a steady fuel source rather than a quick spike. The other interesting thing about super fuel is that it has a low osmolarity, which is really important and why it doesn't irritate the gut, and it sits a lot easier on the stomach than a lot of other products. And honestly, even easier than food sometimes when you don't have an appetite, is because our blood osmolarity is around 200 milliosmoles per kilogram. And that's like where we want most of our drink mixes in general to go, because if you go higher than that, it tends to crowd and cause GI distress. But super fuel is much lower than that. So it doesn't cause as much issues, and it's easier to absorb for our gut and into our bloodstream than other products could be. So those are the really unique key points to super fuel. In the last couple months, we also have released a product called Clear, which is a hydration product that has slightly higher sodium than our super fuel does, but it contains the same cluster dextrin. And so we've taken the technology from super fuel and created a hydration product that tastes like water, which when we go back to talking about flavor fatigue, sometimes mixing up your flavors and having something that tastes like water is also very convenient. I don't know about how it tasted for you, but super fuel is supposed to taste a lot less sweet. Did you?
I watered it down as well.
Yeah.
So I did half the recommended dose, which just worked for my strategy as far as how many calories I needed. And I know actually even on the package, it recommends starting with a lower dose and building up, right? To make sure you like the flavor and that it does digest properly. But I could see where if I wanted to supplement, because I know in Georgia, it was actually quite cool and it was raining most of the time. I wasn't super concerned with sweat loss, but I was supplementing a little bit with electrolytes. That was something you recommend doing. But if I was in the desert, I know in Namibia, Rob said he actually mixed super fuel with electrolytes. And that's exactly where you would love a non-flavored electrolyte mix to mix into your flavored fuel.
Yeah, exactly. So you can mix super fuel in a lot of different ways. You can go as low as 1 scoop in a bottle to, I have athletes putting like 16, 17 scoops in a bottle, which is ridiculous. But for everybody, it really depends on what your caloric needs are and how you're going to use the product. Some people like to concentrate it a ton into like a hand bottle so that it's almost like a gel that they use that's a little bit lighter on their stomach. Some people like to take it into their regular sports drink and add a couple scoops just so that they can get extra calories in. You can use super fuel at 2-3 scoops in a bottle just to get, half the calories if you needed them. The one thing I really love about our product line is it's very flexible. And so I have athletes using super fuel in a ton of different ways. And the Clear to add on top of it is very helpful for when you don't want sweet stuff. But just to be honest, you can really mix anything together, and all the instructions on our packaging are suggestions, but you make it work for your needs. That's the biggest thing, is everyone has different caloric needs. Everyone has different electrolyte needs. So mix it up and test it out in a couple different ways to see what works best for you. I think that's the really nice thing, is that you can make it as sweet, as less sweet, as diluted, whatever you need to do to really make it work for you.
And going back to the cluster dextrin, and I can't remember if this is something you said or if I read this somewhere, but it sounds like it really it gets absorbed more like a complex carbohydrate. Is that right? But then it acts like it digests like a sugar, like a simple sugar. So you kind of get the best of both worlds, and that's maybe where I think you said it sort of can be even easier to digest than normal food. but you still
Yeah.
get that slow release. Whereas maltodextrin, which I think is just corn syrup, right? Is that right? It's pretty much
Yeah, I
just,
mean, all of these are all corn derived products.
yeah.
But yeah, it's more just corn starch or corn syrup with maltodextrin. It's just a lot less concentrated. But you're right where you're talking about the structure there. It can act in your body like a complex carb would, where it's not gonna, spike your blood sugar. It's gonna give you a lot more even, steady energy. Just
Yeah.
as like if we were to eat a whole wheat piece of toast versus a plain white piece of toast, you usually with a whole grain piece of toast, you feel full for a little bit longer. The only big difference is that there's no fiber in super fuels, so you're not getting some of the GI issues, and it's absorbing really easily compared to what a whole grain typically does for us.
Where in, again, this was a 7-day stage race I did, and I'm now going to be looking at doing UTMB, which is a 100-mile race, probably going to take me, closer to 30 hours in a single effort, as opposed to what was, where stage races are essentially a series of marathons. They happen to be over the course of several days. It feels like you're doing an ultra marathon, but from a nutritional standpoint, it's more like doing a series of marathons. At what point do we need to consider other macronutrients like protein and fat?
Yes. So with the stage races you did, it's not as important while you're running to get the fat and the protein. You typically can get enough in your breakfasts and your dinners and in between, outside of your exercise to get that extra nutrition that you need to make sure that you're recovering well. Some people still will have, fats or protein during their runs if they can tolerate it. But a lot of the time for shorter efforts, we typically say, fats and proteins at higher intensities can be really hard on our gut. So I usually, if you're doing shorter distances, shorter times than, long ultra marathons traditionally can be like, where you're doing more stage races, carbohydrates can be your main focus. But when you're doing these long 30-hour, 40-hour races, that's when you actually have to start considering some of the other macronutrients outside of just carbohydrates. And the reason is if you are going for extended amounts of time, you're missing all those other windows of opportunity that you would have had to have fats and protein that you would have had typically. And so then we're worrying about muscle mass loss and, potentially injury because of lack of nutrients or any of those things. So also just staying full longer, because if you're just fueling on carbs, you're just going to keep going up and down and not getting enough steady energy. So when you're doing these longer races, I do try to get my athletes to consume at least some things that have fat and protein. Still, a large majority of your diet is going to be carbohydrates. There was a study done where they assessed some of the ultra runners' diets recently. And they said about 67% of your diet will probably be carbohydrates as an ultra marathoner. But then you'll see, some will be up to 19% in fat and about 19% in protein. Kind of varies on the athlete, but still your largest component is carbohydrates. Protein, you don't have to have in full solid form if it gives you problems. Really what you're aiming to get is those essential amino acids that we cannot produce in our body and we need to consume through food. So having even a liquid protein or a powdered protein could be effective if you're somebody who doesn't like to eat protein during these types of races. I mean, I've seen athletes eat all sorts of different things during ultra marathons. The food variety is so much more than any race I've ever worked with, or any type of other athlete that I'd ever worked with. Ultra marathoners have the widest variety of food that I've ever seen.
Especially in Europe, it's a lot of meats and cheeses and things. It's a lot of kind of more like fresher food, which can be good, but it can also sometimes you just want like a Snickers bar or something, right? Like you just want something sugary. So I find, you really have to kind of research and see what you're going to get and supplement. But I really found that in I my first 200 miler I did years ago, Tour
Mhm.
de Jean, I had very little protein. I was mainly just doing carbs, and I got a lot of water retention. I got a lot of bloating,
Mhm.
and I sort of I did a little bit of research after, and maybe I know just enough to be dangerous, but it
Mhm.
seemed like protein was what I was missing over the course of 4 or 5 days. That's when it really started to matter. And so my next one I did the Swiss Peaks 360. I got a lot more protein. I ate a lot of fish and things like that. Fortunately, I had crew who could bring me that, and it seemed to really help. My recovery went a lot better. I had way less swelling.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about recovery, if you're doing anything longer than I would say like 20 hours, you really have to start thinking about your recovery during the race because you're not recovering with just carbohydrates. Obviously, we want to replenish glycogen in our muscles, and that's what kind of keeps us going. But muscle repair is a huge part of like exercising and building muscle. And so as we're exercising, we're tearing our muscles apart to rebuild them stronger. And if you're not giving it that protein that it needs, and you're only giving it carbohydrates, it's not going to repair as quickly, especially if you're going for multiple days. So recovery becomes really, really important. And that protein intake does become important. I would say if you're doing, shorter distances, you're not doing ultra marathons, you probably don't need protein during exercise, but for ultras, you definitely do. And it does make a difference with bloating because carbohydrates carry water with them. So if you're primarily eating carbohydrates, you're carrying all the water with you. And it is helpful for staying hydrated, but when you're starting to get that bloating feeling, it's not pleasant. And that's what makes it really difficult to keep going.
Yeah. What role do electrolytes play? And aside from the obvious, I mean, there's, I think and by obvious, I mean, it helps, at least I think, with hydration. It helps with retention of water. Is that right? But
Mhm.
is it, I know the science is still out there on how the role of electrolytes when it comes to cramping and other types of things. What do we know? What do we know so far, and what don't we know about electrolytes and the role it
Right.
plays?
Yeah. So when we talk about sweat, our sweat, we think about two things. We think about the volume in which we sweat. So the volume becomes higher in higher temperatures, higher intensities, um, different training methods, all that stuff. Like our volume of sweat is very variable depending on what we're doing. Then the second part of sweat is how many electrolytes we're sweating out. And so that is typically a genetic number. What you eat doesn't really affect it that much. It's not going to change you from being a lightly salty sweater to a super heavy salty sweater. So those are like the two things that I usually consider is you have to think about how much fluid you're losing and then how many electrolytes you're losing. So there's several electrolytes that we lose in our sweat. We sweat out sodium, calcium, magnesium, potassium. But sodium is the electrolyte that we lose the most of and is the most important to replenish because it does make a huge effect in how our hydration goes throughout our training. So when you look at sports nutrition products, you want to make sure that you have something with sodium in it. The level of sodium depends on the person. It's genetic. You know, when we look at the range, on average, most people are around 800 milligrams. That's a pretty
Okay.
average salty sweater. The range does go from 300 to 3,000 though. So if you're a salty sweater, you probably know without getting tested, but and the way you might know is you crave saltier foods. You have salty, grainy skin after workouts or really large salt rims
On
around
your clothing
thing.
and packs and things, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I will say that clothing manufacturers have gotten smarter and they've created like materials that don't show the salt as much. So that might also be like I usually say pay attention to your skin a lot more. You will see it on some stuff, but clothing manufacturers are getting much smarter with the technology of their materials. And so sweat stains don't show as much, or the salt rims around your clothing. So sometimes I'm like, if you rub your forehead and it's super grainy after it's dried, most likely you're saltier sweater, maybe not in the 3000s, but still really salty. So imagine you're an athlete who's losing, 1 to 4 liters of sweat per hour. And then you're also losing somewhere, in the 2000s for sodium. You're losing a lot of sodium. The recommended daily allowance of sodium for most, at least in America, is 2000 milligrams. You're sweating that out in, probably less than an hour. So
Yeah, wow.
Sodium tends to be something that we really care to make sure you're getting enough of. When it comes to cramping, which was another piece of the thing you asked about, the science is still inconclusive on like why we really cramp. We have some ideas. The first thought is poor hydration. I don't think that that's always the culprit, but a lot of the times, if you're not hydrating at all or getting electrolytes, that could be the easiest one to figure out if that's the problem. The second thing is underfueling. So if you're not getting enough carbohydrates, you're fatiguing your muscles more. So that becomes very important to pay attention to if you're experiencing a lot of cramps. But the other thing is that a lot of times cramping comes from just general fatigue, not enough training, which is crazy to think when a lot of us train, but you might not be training the specific muscle correctly that's cramping, or you're loading your foot the wrong way, or like there's so many different
or
things.
maybe just pushing too hard on race day, right?
Exactly.
Beyond your training.
Yeah, exactly. So there's so many different facets to this, and we don't understand completely always why. I usually work through a couple series of things with my athletes to see if something will alleviate it. But if you are experiencing cramping, the one thing that you can do is to have something that's either really sour, really spicy, super salty, like something that is going to almost basically make your mouth and your face pucker, because basically what you're trying to do is distract your body from like the neck up to be able to stop the cramp down lower. Yeah. So it's called the oral gustatory reflex or something like that. I always get the terminology messed up, but there are commercial products out there that can help you stop this. One of them is called Hot Shot. It was developed by 2 Harvard researchers, and can sometimes be found in, sometimes honestly a little easier to travel with if you experience cramping, but even a lemon wedge, a packet of mustard, pickle juice, hot sauce, like any of those things, sour candies. Like I remember those Warhead candies when I was a kid. Like if you put a Warhead candy in your mouth, probably for sure you'll stop the cramping. So that's kind of what we know about cramping, what we know about electrolytes, why they're so important. Sodium and carbohydrates together help us hold on to fluid better. So like, that's why, most sports mixes have some mix of carbohydrates and sodium. And so looking for a hydration drink without carbohydrates is not always the best option when you're exercising, but could be a great option for outside of exercise.
So it's, yeah, I mean, obviously we don't know that there's a direct link between electrolytes and cramping. It seems like there maybe isn't, aside from a placebo almost effect. And so, but it is dangerous to be hyponatremic. So what, and some people, I guess, are just way heavier sweaters. So for the average person, maybe it's less of a concern, but the more we exercise and the more we sweat, the more of a concern it is, especially if we're taking in large amounts of water. What are the dangers of low electrolytes?
Yeah, with low electrolytes, you are basically overloading, or like I usually say to my athletes, you're waterboarding yourself and are basically leading yourself to not have enough electrolytes in your blood to be able to pump blood through your body, make your heart beat, all of those things, use your muscles. And so you can get really hurt with hyponatremia, just almost as bad as if, you just get regularly dehydrated, even if you're consuming. If you flood yourself with too much water and not enough electrolytes, you can experience fainting, you can experience headaches. Early signs are usually things like headaches and fatigue. And sometimes people get extra thirsty. And usually that thirst drive is trying to tell you to have some salt and not more water.
Right.
But really, in general, like it can be very dangerous for most athletes to overwater and undersalt. So making sure when you're sweating, you have electrolytes in some capacity is especially important. I also have to usually tell people coconut water is a great hydrator away from exercise, but not, I mean, it's fine. You can totally have it, enjoy it as a drink regularly. But when you're sweating and losing the high amounts of salt, potassium heavy drink without electrolytes is not going to help you. If you want to use coconut water,
great for recovery, right? Potassium is good for
use
recovery,
it for
not
recovery.
so much for, yeah.
Just don't overdo it because high amounts of potassium can also be really dangerous. So there's a lot of things that we could do. We try to do things that we think are healthy and help ourselves, like drink tons of water or drink coconut water. They're actually not the best options for athletes.
So yeah, so hydration is really important, but so is keeping electrolytes in balance. We know it's not because of cramping though, but it's because of these other much more serious potentially effects. Do you recommend sweat tests? I know that's something that people can get done, or do you think it's just kind of, or can we just kind of go with our, trial and error to determine how much we need in terms of electrolytes? Like how do we determine that?
Yeah, I mean, before sweat tests were developed, Dr. Lim and a lot of other researchers were doing a lot of experiments with their athletes to be able to figure out what the right solution was. So they were doing lots of these different concentrations to test. Someone who may not want to go get a sweat test, cannot get one in their region, or, does not have the funds to do that, can do experiments on themselves with different concentrations to see how much sodium benefits their body. The best way we know to figure this out, even if you go and get a sweat test done, to be able to know how well you're hydrating is if you weigh in and weigh out after a workout. You're able to see how many pounds you've lost. And there's usually for most people a range of acceptable weight to lose, where you're in slight dehydration rather than extreme dehydration. And the closer you can get that gap together, the better. We know that it's not perfect to get 100% back to normal weight after a workout. So you can do it that way. On our blogs at Skratch Labs, we do have some understanding of how to do the whole weigh in, weigh out method and the testing with different amounts of electrolytes. But you can go get sodium sweat tested. So there are different places you can get different kinds of sodium sweat tested. The gold standard is a test called the West Core or the Precision Hydration test. In North America, Precision Hydration is the company that sells the machines that allow us to do the testing. This testing was developed for cystic fibrosis patients, but we found a very important application in sports to be able to determine the amount of sodium somebody is losing in their sweat. So you get that one piece of the puzzle that's really important. Then I still usually get my athletes to weigh themselves in and out to determine their sweat rate at different exercises. But in the last couple of years, we are seeing other sweat testing devices come out and other sweat testing methods. There's a company called Levlin that does testing where you send your sweat in. There is Gatorade, who now makes patches that you can use. I will say they work decently well. They sometimes have some flaws with the mechanics of it. But I will say I've used them and they get you into a t-shirt size, but maybe not a fitted suit. They get you a better understanding of where your hydration is. And now there's, wearables coming out with sweat rate and hydration testing and knowledge. And so you can basically wear a wearable that allows you to understand your hydration at every single workout. So we're at Skratch doing a lot more research on these wearables because we think that they could be very helpful for endurance athletes who may be experiencing different needs for hydration and how important hydration is, especially for ultras. We want to experiment with this and we'll hopefully have more answers soon, but there are wearables out there now as well.
And so, I mean, probably though, a good takeaway would be, I mean, we sweat more than we think, and we lose more sodium than we think, and some people even more, up to 10 times that amount. We're just not getting enough sodium. The average, like an ultra runner like myself, I'm not getting enough sodium in my diet. I need to supplement while I'm drinking water during exercise, period. How much of that? Yes, I need to experiment, but just always trying to supplement with at least some electrolytes is probably a good rule of thumb.
Yeah. And I would say if you can at least get what the average person sweats out around that 800 milligrams per liter, you're putting yourself in a safer space, especially if you're not sure. But I will say, no matter how much you sweat out, the hotter and the more humid it is, and the more you're going to sweat, the more you need to replace. So maybe on a more moderate day, you use 1 scoop of whatever electrolyte mix you use. But if it is significantly warmer or more humid and you know you're going to sweat more, go ahead and, 1.5 scoops, or make sure you have enough bottles with you that you're going to be able to replenish. A lot of the times when it's hotter, we also need more volume, not only just more electrolytes. So pay attention to that. We don't have the same needs all the time. Our needs change based on how much we're sweating. I will also say you typically sweat more in indoor workouts than you do outside.
Is that the relative humidity, or?
It's the fact that when you're outside, you have, the wind, you have all these other environmental factors that help cool you off. You're sometimes running in the shade, all of those things. Whereas indoor, it's a very set climate. And most of the time we don't have a lot of airflow. And even if we do, it's like 1 fan, but our rooms typically run pretty warm. So what I've seen with most athletes is they tend to sweat, their sweat rate goes up in indoor workouts. And all of us at some point, especially unless you live probably in California or Florida, or on the coast somewhere, you're most likely going to do a couple indoor workouts a year. So you got to pay attention to that.
One last quick question about electrolytes, then we'll move on. What about too much electrolytes? Is it mostly just gut problems that we're worried about? If we pop 5 salt pills at once and we haven't tested that, we could get an upset stomach. Or are there other dangers to too much electrolytes?
For most athletes, unless you have heart conditions or any of high blood pressure, I don't typically worry about too much salt. It's really hard to see detriments from oversalting more than it is to undersalt. We see a lot more issues coming up with that. There is, obviously, if you only need, a couple thousand milligrams and you have 10,000, you might see a lot more fluid retention, a lot more bloating, and a lot less urination. So if you are noticing your frequency in urination is decreasing, not always does it mean dehydration. It could, if you're having a lot of sodium, it could mean oversalting yourself. And so trying to drink a little bit of plain fluid might help you. It's not going to hurt you really much. You're not going to fall over or anything. If you oversalt, you might
probably best not to overdo it though.
Don't overdo it. Obviously, I think with anything, we're don't overdo anything, but obviously the things that you're going to feel might be bloating, stomach upset, lack of urination. So pay attention to those things. And most people are pretty good about, if you oversalt, you tend to be really thirsty as well. So your natural drive to drink fluid becomes more because your body's trying to dilute it. So just, if you're getting that extreme thirst as well, maybe try to drink a little bit of water and see how you feel. That might actually help. This is the only instance where I say water is acceptable.
Well, that's really just about, I'm obviously paying attention to what you're doing. If you're taking a lot of salt and you're still thirsty, then logically maybe try more water. If you've just been drinking water and you can't quench your thirst, then you probably need more salt. So it's just a matter of trying to obviously being in tune with what you're putting in your body while you're doing it and how you feel.
Intuition is definitely really big. And I think endurance athletes probably have some of the better intuition that I've seen with athletes, because you guys pay attention to so much of the detail and have to be able to compete in your sport. So practicing intuition, it doesn't come overnight. You kind of have to learn to know what your plan is and how you feel based off that plan usually. But don't be afraid to trust your gut a little bit.
Yeah. Now, I want to shift to just talking general diet. So, and starting with iron. and ferritin. I've suffered from low ferritin. My girlfriend Audrey has had super low ferritin, like single digits, and had to resort to iron infusions. But she unfortunately has had to stop and lead up to UTMB because those are banned. But most women and a lot of guys I know who are ultra runners suffer from low iron. It doesn't seem to be linked to diet necessarily. What can we do as athletes to, first of all, how do we know if we have low iron? How, what kind of test do you recommend, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, so iron is kind of tricky because everyone kind of absorbs iron differently, and how we store it, everyone is kind of different. But when it comes to iron, we see it a lot more in females due to menstruation, but male runners are typically seen to also have low iron. And it's because of the strides that you guys make, and the foot striking actually decreases iron in your body. And so iron becomes very important. Iron is also very important when you are training or racing in altitude. Those are the two times where iron is important, as a runner and in altitude, which most ultra runners are training or racing in altitude. So we need to be really ultra vigilant when it comes to iron. Consuming iron is really great in our real food, but there's a lot of things that we eat that can block absorption, things like tea and coffee, and things, there's certain other foods. Caffeine can also do it, but there's also foods that we can eat with iron to help with absorption, like vitamin C. So you definitely want to be able to have that good variety in your diet. And if you are deficient in iron, to be able to maybe not have caffeine or, some of those other foods around the time of our consumption of iron. But testing wise, you want to go to your doctor and you want to ask for a ferritin test. If you ask for iron, they might test the iron in, there's a couple different iron tests. And so asking for your ferritin level, if you are under 20, that is when it becomes a concern. And that's usually when we have to either start on a elemental iron supplementation. And if it's sometimes we even start with infusions, depending on how quickly you can get your numbers up. We really do care about this for athletes because iron binds in our blood with oxygen. And so the more iron you have, the more oxygenated your blood is. And obviously for altitude, that's extremely important because there's a lack of oxygen in the air there. And we want to make sure that we're getting enough in. Anywhere over 3,000 kilometers is really where we care about iron supplementation and additional carbohydrate intake. Actually, both of those things are, important for altitude, but just in general with iron, you got to supplement it every day if you're low. Everyone has different, every physician has a different protocol. Work with them or a dietitian to figure out how to bring your iron numbers up. Ideally, when you're going to be racing or training in altitude, you want that number to be around 100 or more.
Yeah, that's what I read. It's as a male athlete, and last time I got tested, I was at like 33, so I was right on what they consider like okay and poor. But it sounds like I need to bring it up quite a bit. So, and I was just down in Colorado as well, and I know when you're at altitude, we're talking about hydration. You really have to hydrate. You have to drink more than you normally do, but you also have to watch your diet, right? You have to, like you said, increase carbohydrates. Over 3,000 meters, I think you said?
Yeah, over 3,000 meters is when we see that there's a higher energy availability and we're using more glycogen from our body and just need more carbs. So usually I say increase up to 20 to 30% if you're above 3,000 kilometers.
Is that just because of the increase in effort, like a higher heart rate for the same output, or is there something else happening in our bodies that require more energy?
Yeah, no, it's the culmination of everything that we do with training, but also the lack of oxygen and the lack of blood flow, the flow of our blood and the nutrient absorption and transportation is not as easily available. And so we have to be more aware of carbohydrate intake. So I definitely say, like, if you can, fuel more, because a lot of times we start to get really tired. If you're starting to feel altitude sickness, you get very, very tired, dizzy. So hydrating, iron supplementation. And I usually start that about 6 weeks before going into altitude with my athletes. And then getting more carbohydrates in. So more carbs, more iron.
It's so interesting because doing races, like I was down there crewing at the Hard Rock 100, which is at altitude. It starts at 10,000 feet, goes up to 14,000,
yeah,
averages about 11. And a lot of people have trouble keeping food down. And here's a race where you need a higher amount of calories, and a lot of people can't keep the food down to begin with. So that's maybe where supplementing with powdered drinks and things would help maybe get some additional calories. Yeah.
Yeah. Drinking a liquid at altitude is so much easier. And trying to drink more highly dense, like nutritionally dense foods, because then you can eat less things, is also really helpful at altitude. But I usually recommend, if you are racing in altitude, to try to get there like 5 days before if you can feasibly. If not, usually they say to just only try to get there 1 day before. I don't know truly like if that's scientifically proven or not, but it's a lot of the conversations that I hear and talk about with different people who are in the field. That ability to acclimate a little bit is definitely very important. Even me in Colorado, we're at 6,000, but I go to Leadville, that's 10,000. I was huffing and puffing over there, and it's not that much of a difference really when you're already at 6,000. I can only imagine if you come from sea level. Like, I was walking across the street and I was running out of breath. So getting acclimated is super important.
It's hard coming from sea level, but I definitely, anecdotally, I have experienced that, where there's a dip. So the day you arrive or the day after, you feel fine, but the next day, like you get a dip where you can tell your body's going, okay, we better get to work here. Yeah. And it spends a day or two, and then a couple of days later you catch up. So I think definitely around the 3-day mark there's a dip, and you want to avoid that. You either, like you say, show up the day before, show up 5-6 days early, but don't show up in the middle there, or rather don't race in the middle there, because it's putting a lot of stress in your body.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What about the only other thing I really wanted to touch on here was the role of sleep. How does sleep and nutrition, what interplay is there?
Yeah. So as a dietitian, I'm not an expert on sleep, but I have spent probably the last 2 years looking into sleep more, because sleep science has become a lot more hyped, which is great because we do need to be sleeping more. But what we're noticing with sleep is that sleep can affect your metabolism in so many different ways, and the way that you can process the foods that you're eating. So I ideally recommend my athletes to get as much sleep and as much rest in general that they can. But where sleep comes into play and important for nutrition is, first of all, when we are sleeping, that is when most of our muscle recovery is being done. So if you can get good sleep, you're going to have better muscle recovery. And sometimes with that, if you have a hard time falling asleep, or, you're not having as great recovery, I always recommend like a high protein snack right before bed, maybe an hour before bed, to help with keeping you full so you can fall asleep better, but also to help aid in that recovery process overnight. Because a lot of us maybe have dinner early and maybe don't have a snack, and then kind of try to go to bed early, or go to bed a little hungry, and maybe don't get as great of recovery as we could be. And then the other thing that we've learned, we have done some work with continuous glucose monitors at Skratch. And what we have learned is that if you are lacking sleep, your nutrition metabolism becomes very different than what it typically should be. So there's research backing this up. There was a study done, and they said that if you're sleeping, 6 hours or less every night, and then you try to catch up on the weekends, your blood glucose actually won't regulate back to normal with the typical things that you eat. And we've also personally experienced it. Dr. Lim and I both have. When we're at races and we're not sleeping because we're crewing for athletes or helping them, we might come back and eat a salad, and you'll see the spike on our CGM just going up like it's like we had a bag of Skittles or something. So we know that lack of sleep is going to affect our blood glucose. It's going to affect our overall metabolism. It might affect our recovery. So getting 7+ hours a night is really recommended. And getting more consistent sleep over the week rather than trying to catch all of it up on the weekend or on specific days of the week is so much better for you than if you try to do it all in one run. I am pretty good about practicing better sleep hygiene. I was not perfect at it ever. I still am not great at it all the time, but practicing, put on your sleep reminder on your phone, turn down those blue, get those blue lights out or whatever, the blue light blocking glasses, do anything that you can to get a better sleep routine so that you can sleep more regularly.
Yeah. So I'm going to be traveling on Monday. I'm leaving for Europe. And my challenge with traveling all the time is getting onto that new rhythm, right? So it takes like a good week to adjust to that kind of time change. What can I do from a diet standpoint to help me, if anything, when traveling to avoid getting sick and to help me, get onto the new cycle, and even what should I be looking out for while I'm traveling, sitting on a plane for hours? Is there anything I can do from a diet standpoint to help me?
Yeah. So first things first, hydration is super important when traveling. When we get through the airport, a lot of us, if we travel with the water bottle, it's amazing, because you can nowadays fill it up pretty much anywhere in the airport. Bring a couple packets of powder, whatever your favorite one is, dump it in there and start drinking, especially before you get on the plane so that you can use the restroom before you have to get on the plane, because that's always the biggest gripe, especially international travel. You don't want to be like poking the person next to you like, hey, can I go to the bathroom? I hate to be that pest most of the time.
So pre-hydrate. Yeah. Just like a race, right? Like an event.
Yeah, I try to pre-hydrate as much as I can, but still hydrate on the plane regularly. And if I need to use the restroom, I will. But the electrolytes allow you to hold on to the fluid a little bit better so that you don't have to use the bathroom every 5 minutes. Other things that you can do, get up and walk around a little bit. Like, don't stay seated unless it's an overnight flight. If you can get the sleep, you can do it. I usually recommend things like tart cherries, and now you can buy tart cherry juice in like small concentrates that you can travel with. You can't obviously take a big bottle of tart cherry juice liquid, but you could probably in your travel bag get away with a 1 ounce tart cherry juice concentrate. What tart cherry juice has is high antioxidants that help us overall with recovery and all of those things. But tart cherry juice also has it naturally stimulates melatonin in our body. So you can get to sleep a lot better. And so if you can produce natural melatonin, it's a lot better than taking melatonin. I think we tend to overconsume melatonin, especially athletes, and more does not.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that, of using the melatonin pills. So I think tart cherry probably it sounds like a better way to go.
And it's okay to use melatonin, but more does not mean better. More absolutely does not mean better when it comes to melatonin. We're actually seeing lower doses be more effective, like 1 to 2 milligrams rather than the 10 milligrams that a lot of us are taking. So less is more when it comes with melatonin. You won't get that melatonin hangover that a lot of people complain about, but trying to get good sleep. If you have an overnight flight, try to do it that way. But the other thing with jet lag is, try to keep yourself up to a normal time when you get there. Don't try to take a nap. Eat and hydrate really well. We tend to, get, either excited. We try to have a lot of caffeine when we get to a new place. Try to stick to your normal stuff, especially before a race. Yeah. If you can get as normal to what you usually do, it's always really exciting to be in a new place with new cuisine, all that stuff, but try to stick as normal as you can because it does help you stay in a routine. Staying in a routine is really key.
There was a question here I missed from Seth. As far as, are there any special considerations? We talked about hydration, but when it comes to heat, are there any other considerations like there are at altitude when it comes to nutrition?
With heat is probably the hardest thing for most of us to deal with. A lot of us are able to deal with cold in a lot of different ways. Our bodies are more naturally adapted to adapting to cold, but heat is really difficult for our bodies. They don't quite understand what's going on. So nutritionally, hydration is really the biggest thing that you can do. There's not much else nutritionally that you can do, but there are some other things that you can do during races, especially if you have a crew. In cycling, a lot of the things that we do like pantyhose ice socks because they don't weigh a lot. You take the pantyhose, fill it with ice, and then tie them up, and you can shove it in your vest. You can put it over your neck, really easy. And then once the ice melts, you know, the pantyhose, you just shove it into your pocket or whatever, and it doesn't weigh anything. So if you have a crew that's able to help you and they can do something like that, that can help you bring down your core body temperature when you're racing. If you see a creek or anything, a body of water, jump in it, cool down your body, because eating becomes easier in general, and just bringing down that core body temperature is super important. But you can also train with heat. Heat acclimatization is a real thing and can extremely help you when it comes to it, especially if you live somewhere that's usually cooler and you race in places that are warmer.
Does that tie into eating as well? Like, should you be eating while you heat train, training your stomach to eat during the heat, or is that less? Yeah. Is it more about the sweating?
You should be able to train your body with eating during the heat, but usually when we heat train, we talk about saunas a lot of the time. I don't necessarily think you want to be eating in a sauna. I don't know. No. I don't think I've ever tried to, but if you are training at some points of the year in hotter weather, try to train your nutrition that way too. Like, try new things in that temperature too, if you have the opportunity, so that you can train your nutrition. But a lot of times you just have to get your body used to eating more so that it can get more. And the heat, you just got to figure out how to cool your body down. But usually heat acclimatization, we use saunas a lot of the time, or jacuzzis sometimes, to get us used to that. There's lots of different protocols for that, but we do recommend, a lot of our athletes will use saunas to heat train themselves after exercise, somewhere from 5 to 30 minutes most days.
And isn't it true that when we're trying to heat acclimate, it's actually counterintuitive, because we actually are trying to train our bodies to sweat better, right? Sweat more effectively, not less. And you think of sweating as a bad thing. Oh, I'm sweating, I'm not acclimated. But it's the opposite, right? We're actually trying to sweat sooner to cool ourselves down, because that's our cooling process. Yeah.
Sweat is our natural body's defense to heat. And so we put perspiration on our bodies so that we can cool our bodies down in some way. And so, the sauna training is allowing us to understand and get more acclimated to that higher heat, but it's actually also helping us to learn how to sweat during that time.
So by extension, the better heat acclimated we are, in theory, the higher our volume sweat is. So we actually need more electrolytes, not less, potentially.
Yeah, I would say that could be true. That stuff we're still trying to learn a little bit more about. There's so much about hydration that we don't completely understand yet. We do know that you could sweat out different concentrations at different times due to different sweat rates. And so that's the question at Skratch that we're really trying to figure out, is like, what's going on when we're sweating more, especially during the heat. There hasn't been very many active hydration sweat studies done. A lot of the sweat studies have to be done at rest or collected off of them and done not in real time. So it's really fascinating stuff that we're trying to work on, because these are the questions we have too. It's like, what's really going on?
Yeah. And you'd almost want to do a test, sort of get a baseline, and then heat train, and then do another test and see if it's changed. And lots to learn there. Another question here from Dan, and this is actually an obvious one it's a great question. What about carbo loading? Where are we at on the science of carbo loading?
Yeah, carbo loading does work. It actually really does. And for endurance athletes, ultra endurance athletes, you guys are consuming a lot more carbs. So carbo loading might look a little bit different. Most ultra athletes are consuming somewhere around 90 grams per hour of carbs during exercise from what we see in the research. I've had ultra runners consuming 120, 130 grams of carbs per hour, but really that before time, loading may not help you increase speed. I think that's where people are like, carb loading is going to make me faster. Carb loading is not going to make you faster, but that increased glycogen is going to help you maintain your pace for longer. That's really the key to carb loading for ultra athletes, is that it's not going to make you any faster. It's actually just going to help you maintain for longer. And so what we want to do is, typically most of us are eating somewhere around 50% of our normal intake as carbs. We said sometimes up to 67% for racing, but like on a normal day, when you think about what your plate looks like, most of us, like endurance athletes, are going to eat probably around 50% of our plate as carbohydrates. When you get closer to race, you actually want even more than that. I try to get athletes up to like 70-ish% of their plate as carbohydrates, and it can help.
And sorry, can I ask a quick clarifying question? That's because we still want to keep the protein the same. We're just then adding carbs, right? So it's actually increasing the total quantity of carbs, and overall the total number of calories.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to increase the amount of carbs. And I usually say you end up decreasing a lot of the time.
How many days in advance? Or 2-3 days, or
I
just
usually say 3 to 5 days, depending on your race and how well you adjust to increased carb intake. The thing I usually see with runners that I always hear is train low, run high. And like, I don't know if that's an ultra thing, but it is with a lot of like shorter distance runners, to train on lower carbohydrates and then run on higher carbohydrates. That science is really not there. So don't be afraid to eat those carbs, and carb loading might, if you're already eating a lot of carbs, it might not make a huge difference for you, but the whole key is to preload and be prepared rather than, potentially deplete yourself and have issues. It's not going to hurt you. It probably will help you hold on to better, more fluid, and just being better prepared.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know some of the elite marathoners will do carb depleted runs, but they do like 2 in a training. Like they don't do, it's not every weekend. It's really hard on the body, right?
Exactly. It is not easy on our body. And I think that people take advice like that or hear things like that, and then they go to the extreme, and the extreme is never helpful. So it really, that train low, like it's so dangerous for endurance athletes, because you rely on carbohydrates to train, and to be able to compete. And so if you are depleted, you have a higher risk for injury. You have a higher risk for energy deficiency that in the long run will cause 10 times more problems than if you just ate the carbs. To be honest, it's the argument that I have to sometimes have with people. But in ultra, I think the other thing that I hear a lot of is eating more fat to be more fat adapted.
Yeah. That was a big trend a couple of years ago. I don't know as many people doing it now, but definitely it seemed like cutting edge at the time. I don't know if we've learned much in the last couple of years since, or.
Yeah. And I think that was really, you're right. Like a couple of years ago, that was really big. And the people who tried it moved away from it pretty quickly because it wasn't really working. We see that it's not detrimental to performance, in a shorter distance, exercise. But when you're doing these multi-stage races, in research, what we've seen is that you're actually, your body fat might lower in the first couple of days. You're using that fuel, but then after, your performance starts depleting because you have no carbs in your body to help you. So
especially when probably doing higher intensity workouts, I would imagine that's where you really suffer.
Yeah. So we do see it can be effective sometimes, but like, it's not really the story that was told at first.
It seemed to me like it wasn't sustainable, but that it could be something you do as a macro cycle. Like there might be a period in the season. Cause I remember like years ago, I was doing VO2 and lactic threshold testing at this lab very regularly. And a friend of
Yeah.
mine came in and got tested who was doing a high fat diet. He was doing the, bulletproof coffee, all that stuff. And
Mhm.
his profile was completely different. He could sustain on fats for much longer. But the second he hit a certain point, it shot up where he was just pure carbohydrates, whereas my profile was much more steady. So in theory, if you looked at that on paper, where we would run a 100-mile effort, he was burning a higher percentage of body fat
Mhm.
and using just aerobic capacity, I should say.
Yeah.
Whereas mine was slowly going into the glycogen. But he wasn't able to perform when it came to speed workouts and things,
Mhm.
because again, it just shot up and he couldn't sustain those efforts.
Yeah.
So it wasn't good or bad. It was just different. And when I saw that, I thought that would be good to do at a certain point in the season, but
Mhm.
not during the point in the season when you're doing, for example, your speed work.
Exactly.
So I think it feels to me like, that this is probably a topic for a whole other conversation,
Yeah.
but it's like macro periodizing your diet to match your training cycles and where you're at in your season. Are you racing? Are you recovering? Are you, doing
Yeah.
a big volume build?
Yeah, periodization is super important and we use it all the time. I do different things with different sports, but timing and periodization are super important for whatever your training goals are. And we might adjust your nutrition based off of that. And I think that that is important to know. And also, I find that a lot of people will do VO2 max testing and your values change quite regularly. So unless you're getting tested regularly, what you're at when you get tested might not be relevant 3 weeks later, if you're training really hard and you're reaching a certain goal. So I always say those tests in an exact moment won't tell you much. It's the trends that you see after doing multiple tests that really tell the story that we want to know. So
Yeah.
with any testing, I think that's completely true. The only test that I don't find that to be true with is sodium sweat concentration because it's a genetic number, but pretty much anything else like sweat rate, your sweat rate can change on how well trained you are. And with everything else, like I think that we focus a lot on like single time point not factors in anything that we're doing with our training, and instead of looking at the trends that really carry on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that'd be a great topic for us to
Yeah,
come back to maybe in a couple of months. We could talk
absolutely.
about macro periodizing your diet to match your training cycles. I would love to talk more about
Yeah,
that.
that would be really fun.
Yeah, different phases of a season. Well, Colette, this has been really interesting for me. I'm sure for everybody else out there as well. There weren't a lot of questions, but I think that's probably because we were hitting a lot of the big topics people wanted to hear about.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time. It was great to talk to you and to catch up here. And like I said, we'll have to do it again in a couple months if you have time, and we can dive deeper into some of these things that we talked about today.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a pleasure being here. And if anybody has more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Skratch Labs, info@skratchlabs.com, or reach out to us on our social media pages. We're happy to help any athlete that has any questions. I know that we talked about a lot and it was a lot to unpack for a lot of people. So we're available if there's more stuff that comes up. And hopefully we'll get to talk again soon about more stuff.
And you did say that there's a blog as well on skratchlabs.com where you have lots of resources, it sounds like.
Yeah, we have a blog that has tons of science, tons of recipes. So if you don't find something you're looking for, let us know. We could probably write something up.
Okay, that's awesome. Thanks again, Colette. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Hopefully you found this interesting, and I will talk to you soon.
Yeah, great. All right. Everyone take care. Have a great evening.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.